3 days after I buried my father, I came home at sunrise and found a giant auction sign planted in the middle of my front yard. Two strangers in pressed shirts were walking my pasture with clipboards, measuring things they had no business measuring, and a woman I barely knew was standing beside my fence talking on the phone like she owned the place. The crazy part wasn't that they were on my land. The crazy part was that she was telling the sheriff I was the trespasser. My name is Cole Harper, and until that morning, I thought I'd already lived through the worst week of my life. My family's ranch sits outside a little town in western Wyoming, where the mountains seem close enough to touch on clear mornings, and everybody knows everybody's business whether they admit it or not. My grandfather bought the property back in 1964 with money he'd saved driving cattle across 3 states. My father expanded it. I grew up working it. Every fence post, every barn beam, every stretch of gravel road carried a memory. After my wife Rachel passed away from cancer 4 years earlier, the ranch became more than land to me. It became the last place where everything still felt connected. My 17-year-old son Luke and I kept things running together. It wasn't easy, but it was ours. Then Pine Ridge Estates arrived. A developer bought several hundred acres bordering my ranch and built a subdivision full of expensive houses, decorative stone entrances, and people who liked the idea of country living more than actual country living. Within a year, they had formed an HOA, and within 6 months they had elected Vanessa Drake as president. Now, everybody has met someone like Vanessa before, the kind of person who mistakes authority for wisdom. The kind who carries a clipboard like it's a badge and speaks with the confidence of someone who's never been told no. At first, the complaints were almost funny. One letter claimed my cattle were lowering neighborhood aesthetics. Another claimed my equipment shed disrupted scenic views. One resident even complained that hearing my rooster at sunrise created unnecessary noise pollution. I laughed most of those off. My grandfather used to say, "Never argue with people looking for problems. They'll always find new ones." I should have listened, because over time Vanessa stopped complaining and started targeting. She sent notices about my fences, then my access road, then my livestock trailers. Then she somehow decided my property should follow HOA landscaping standard despite the fact I had never signed a single HOA document in my life. Every conversation with her felt like stepping into quicksand. One afternoon she marched onto my property holding a folder full of papers. "Cole," she said, smiling in that way people smile when they think they're smarter than you, "community standards apply to everyone." "No," I said, "they apply to members. You border the community." "I also border a river doesn't mean I have to follow fish regulations." She didn't appreciate that joke. Things got worse after that. Every few weeks another letter appeared. Every few months another threat. Still, I never imagined how far she was willing to go. Then my father died. The call came late on a Sunday night. Massive stroke. No warning. No chance to say goodbye. One moment I was feeding cattle. The next I was driving 8 hours north through darkness trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt smaller. Luke stayed behind with family friends while I handled funeral arrangements. I figured I'd be gone at least a week. Turns out somebody else had been counting on that too. The funeral was on Wednesday. By Thursday afternoon, I was helping my mother sort through old photographs and paperwork. That evening my phone buzzed. It was Luke. At first I almost ignored it. The kid texted me constantly, usually memes. Sometimes sports scores, occasionally questions he could have answered himself with 30 seconds of effort. But this text felt different. "Dad, you need to come home now." I called immediately. He answered on the first ring. "Dad." His voice sounded wrong. The kind of wrong that tightens your stomach before your brain catches up. "What's going on?" "I don't know exactly." "What do you mean you don't know?" There are people here. What people? They've been taking pictures, measuring things, talking about some kind of auction. I sat upright. Auction? Yeah, I heard him exhale. And Vanessa's been here twice. That was all I needed to hear. I left before sunrise. 8 straight hours on the road, too much coffee, not enough sleep. Every mile felt longer than the last. The entire drive I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. A misunderstanding, some paperwork issue. Maybe somebody confused properties. Maybe somebody filed something incorrectly. Maybe. But deep down, a different feeling kept growing. The feeling that this wasn't an accident, that somebody had waited until I was gone, that somebody had chosen this exact moment on purpose. I reached the ranch just after 6 in the morning. The first thing I noticed wasn't the sign, it wasn't the vehicles, it wasn't even the strangers, it was the silence. Normally my place feels alive, wind moving through grass, cattle shifting in the pasture, birds waking up. That morning it felt wrong, like a stage before the actors walk out. Then I saw it. A giant wooden sign nearly 6 feet tall, public land auction. Saturday, on-site bidding. I honestly thought I was hallucinating. I parked my truck so hard gravel sprayed across the driveway. 2 men looked up from their measuring equipment. One adjusted his glasses, the other checked his clipboard. Neither looked surprised to see me, which somehow made everything worse. I walked straight toward them. "What exactly are you doing?" The taller one pointed toward the sign. "Pre-auction assessment." I stared at him. "I'm sorry, what?" "Property evaluation prior to sale." I laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes your brain refuses to accept reality. "This property isn't for sale." The man shrugged. "Our paperwork says otherwise." Behind them I heard an SUV door slam. I turned, and there she was, Vanessa Drake, walking toward us with the confidence of someone who thought she'd already won. She stopped a few feet away and folded her arms. "Good morning, Cole." I looked at her, then at the sign, then back at her. And for the first time in years I felt something colder than anger. I felt betrayal. Because suddenly every complaint, every letter, every threat started fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. This hadn't started last week. This had been building for years. "What did you do?" I asked quietly. Vanessa smiled. The kind of smile people wear right before everything falls apart. And that's when she pulled out her phone, started dialing, and said the 5 words that changed everything. "Hello, Sheriff's Department. We have a trespasser." I just stood there for a second, trying to decide whether I should laugh or lose my temper. Vanessa held the phone to her ear without taking her eyes off me, almost like she wanted to enjoy every second of it. "Yes, that's right," she said calmly. "The individual is refusing to leave property currently under HOA administration." I actually looked behind me to see if she was talking about somebody else. Then she pointed directly at me. "He's right here." I couldn't help shaking my head. "Vanessa, have you finally lost it?" She covered the phone with her hand and smiled. "You should have stayed at your father's funeral a little longer, Cole." Those words hit me harder than I expected. She knew exactly where I'd been. She knew exactly why I'd left town. Somehow, that made everything feel even uglier. Before I could answer, she went right back to the call. "Yes, we'll wait for the deputy." The 2 surveyors quietly kept measuring my fence line like none of this was unusual. One of them hammered a small orange marker into the ground about 10 feet inside my pasture. "Hey," I yelled, "don't touch my property." The younger guy barely glanced up. "We're marking future lot divisions." Future lot divisions. Those 4 words echoed in my head. Somebody wasn't planning to sell my ranch as a ranch. They were planning to carve it up. About 20 minutes later, a county sheriff's SUV rolled onto my driveway. Deputy Ethan Brooks stepped out. I'd known Ethan for years. We'd coached Little League together when our boys were younger. He looked from me to Vanessa, then to the giant auction sign, and frowned before saying a single word. "Morning, Cole. Morning. Mind telling me what's going on?" Before I could open my mouth, Vanessa stepped forward carrying a thick binder. "Deputy, thank you for coming. This individual is interfering with a lawful property assessment authorized by Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." Ethan accepted the binder but didn't say anything. He simply started reading. Vanessa continued talking, filling every second of silence. According to her story, my property had accumulated years of unpaid community penalties. She claimed I had ignored repeated notices, violated land maintenance agreements, abandoned disputed boundary areas, and forfeited certain ownership rights under HOA enforcement procedures. It sounded impressive if you didn't actually know what any of those words meant. Ethan finally looked up. "Cole." I reached into my truck and grabbed the weathered leather folder that never left my glove compartment. Inside were copies of my deed, tax records, surveys, easements, everything my father insisted I always keep close. "This ranch has been in my family for 60 years, I said. "I've never signed a single HOA document. I've never agreed to a single HOA rule." Ethan compared the papers. His forehead wrinkled deeper with every page he turned. Vanessa crossed her arms. "He's conveniently ignoring years of certified notices." "What notices?" I asked. "The ones you refused to accept." "I've never refused certified mail in my life. Refusing delivery still counts." "How would I refuse something I never saw?" She didn't answer. She simply looked away. That tiny hesitation stayed with me. Ethan closed the folder. "This doesn't look criminal," he finally said. "Looks like a civil dispute." Vanessa's smile disappeared. "Deputy, he's trespassing." Ethan looked around slowly. "On whose land?" "HOA property." He pointed toward my house. "According to county records, that's still Cole's address." Vanessa's voice sharpened. "The assessment changes that. An assessment doesn't transfer ownership. The auction will." Ethan sighed the way parents sigh before explaining something obvious to a stubborn teenager. "An auction doesn't happen because somebody puts up a sign." I almost smiled. Almost. Vanessa clearly wasn't used to hearing the word no. She took a deep breath, forced another smile onto her face, then looked directly at me. "Enjoy your little victory today." She nodded toward the sign. "Saturday is still coming." Before climbing back into her SUV, she stopped beside me and lowered her voice so only I could hear. "People like you always think history protects them." She looked toward the ranch house. "History doesn't pay legal fees." Then she drove away. Ethan handed my documents back. "I'd recommend calling an attorney." "Already trying." "Do it fast." After he left, I walked around the property by myself. Every orange survey flag they had planted felt like an insult. I started pulling them out one by one until I reached the north fence where my neighbor Henry Lawson was leaning against his pickup. Henry had lived beside us for almost 40 years. He wasn't much for conversation, but when he spoke, people listened. "They were here yesterday too," he said. "Yesterday?" he nodded. "Started measuring before sunrise." "Why didn't anyone call me?" He looked uncomfortable. "We thought maybe you knew." I looked toward the subdivision. Curtains moved inside several windows. People had been watching. Some probably believed Vanessa. Others probably didn't know what to believe. Henry reached into his truck and handed me an old envelope. "Found this blowing across my pasture this morning." Inside was a glossy auction flyer. My address, my land, my bond, my family's home, printed like it already belonged to somebody else. I stared at it for a long time before folding it carefully into my pocket. Anger wasn't really the right word anymore. Anger burns hot. This felt colder, more focused, like something inside me had quietly decided enough was enough. The first person I called was my attorney, straight to voicemail, vacation until Tuesday, of course. The second attorney couldn't meet until next week. The third specialized in divorces. By lunchtime, I still didn't have legal help. What I did have was a driveway full of tire tracks and the growing realization that somebody had planned this around my absence. That afternoon Luke came home. He walked onto the porch carrying 2 grocery bags and stopped when he saw the auction sign still standing across the field. "Dad." "Yeah. They're serious, aren't they?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at the house behind us. My mother used to bring lemonade out onto this porch every summer. Rachel used to sit on those steps watching Luke chase calves around the pasture. My father carved his initials into the barn door before I was even born. Every corner of this place held somebody I loved. Losing the ranch had never been about money. It would have been like burying my family all over again. Luke sat beside me. "What are we gonna do?" I looked out across the pasture where the auction sign leaned against the afternoon wind. For the first time all day, I smiled. Not because things were getting better, because something suddenly didn't make sense. Vanessa had acted like someone holding all the cards, but people who really have the law on their side don't usually spend years sending threats before making a move. They certainly don't rush everything while the owner is out of town burying his father. They wait, they follow procedure, they don't gamble, which meant one thing kept echoing louder inside my head. What if she wasn't rushing because she was confident? What if she was rushing because she was scared I'd discover something before Saturday? That single thought changed everything. And by the next morning, one unexpected phone call would prove I was asking exactly the right question. The phone rang just after 8 the next morning while I was repairing a loose gate hinge. I almost let it go to voicemail because I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to answer. "Mr. Harper," a woman asked. "This is Abigail Mercer. I'm a property attorney in Casper. Henry Lawson called me last night." I looked over toward Henry's ranch and smiled to myself. That old man had apparently been making phone calls while I was trying to solve everything alone. "He said you might need help quickly." "That's putting it mildly," I replied. By noon, Abigail was sitting at my kitchen table with every document I owned spread across it. Unlike everyone else who had glanced through my paperwork, she actually read every page. She barely spoke for almost 30 minutes. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and looked directly at me. "Cole, this isn't just wrong. What is it?" "It's impossible." She pointed to my original deed. "Your ranch was specifically excluded from Pine Ridge Estates when the subdivision was approved. Meaning the HOA never had authority over your property. Not yesterday, not today, not ever." I felt my shoulders relax for the first time all week, but Abigail wasn't finished. "And there's something else." She slid another document toward me. "This amendment extending HOA authority." She tapped the signature line. "Is fake." I stared at it. "Fake? I've already called the county recorder." She looked almost angry now. "No approved amendment matching this document has ever been filed." Suddenly, every strange thing Vanessa had done made perfect sense. The rushed timeline, the pressure, the fake notices. She wasn't standing on solid legal ground. She was standing on quicksand and hoping nobody looked down. Abigail immediately started making calls. Within an hour, she reached the surveying company listed on Vanessa's paperwork. Their owner sounded completely shocked. "We never surveyed Mr. Harper's ranch," he said over speakerphone, "and that's definitely not my employee's signature." Abigail looked at me. "Now we have fraud." Things moved unbelievably fast after that. She filed an emergency injunction stopping the scheduled auction and contacted both the county attorney and the state real estate commission. By late afternoon, local reporters started calling. Apparently, someone inside Pine Ridge Estates had leaked the story. That someone turned out to be Olivia Bennett, the HOA secretary. She showed up at my ranch carrying a laptop and looking like she hadn't slept all night. "I can't do this anymore," she said quietly. "Vanessa lied to all of us." She opened her computer and pulled up months of emails. There it was in black and white. Vanessa discussing my absence after my father's death. Vanessa telling board members the timing was perfect. Vanessa talking about increasing subdivision values if my ranch could be developed. One sentence made my stomach turn. If Hopper fights back, he'll be too late. Abigail simply looked at me and said, "Save every one of these." Saturday morning arrived colder than usual. Instead of a crowd of excited bidders, my driveway filled with sheriff's deputies, news vans, neighbors, and attorneys. The auction sign still stood where they'd planted it 3 days earlier. Vanessa pulled in exactly at 9 o'clock wearing the same confident smile she'd worn all week. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then she saw the cameras, she saw Abigail, she saw the deputies, most importantly. She saw the judge's signed injunction in Abigail's hand. "This auction is suspended by court order," Abigail announced loud enough for everyone to hear. Vanessa laughed. "That's ridiculous." "No," Abigail answered calmly. "What's ridiculous is trying to auction property your organization doesn't control." Vanessa tried walking past her toward the sign. Sheriff Daniel Rhodes stepped directly into her path. "Ma'am," she looked annoyed, "move, I can't do that." "Do you know who I am?" The sheriff smiled politely. "At the moment, someone I'd like to ask a few questions." She looked around for support. None came. Several HOA board members had quietly stayed home. Others stood off to the side pretending they barely knew her. Olivia walked forward carrying her laptop. "Sheriff, I have copies of every email." Vanessa's face lost all color. "Olivia." "No." Olivia shook her head. "You told us this was legal." She turned toward the deputies. "It wasn't." The next few minutes happened almost in slow motion. Detectives arrived carrying additional documents. Investigators confirmed the forged signatures. The county recorder verified no legal authority existed. One of the surveyors admitted they had simply followed instructions without verifying ownership. Finally, Sheriff Rhodes stepped in front of Vanessa. "Vanessa Drake." He paused just long enough for every camera to focus on him. "You're under arrest on suspicion of fraud, forgery, attempted property theft, and conspiracy." "This is insane," she shouted as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "That ranch should have been part of our community years ago." I couldn't help answering. "Maybe in your imagination." She glared at me while deputies escorted her toward the patrol vehicle. "You'll regret humiliating me." I looked across the pasture toward my grandfather's barn glowing in the morning sun. "No," I said quietly. "I would have regretted letting you take it." After the patrol cars drove away, the crowd remained strangely silent. Then Henry walked over to the auction sign, looked at me, and asked, "Mind if I do the honors?" I laughed for the first time in days. "Be my guest." Together we pulled the sign out of the ground. It took both of us because they'd buried it deep. We carried it over to the old burn pile beside the equipment shed and tossed it on top. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. Somehow that made the moment feel even more real. It wasn't about winning. It was about putting something ugly where it belonged. Over the following months, the investigation uncovered far more than my case. Vanessa had pressured dozens of homeowners with fabricated violations, manipulated HOA records, and used intimidation whenever anyone questioned her authority. Several civil lawsuits followed. The HOA board resigned almost entirely, and new leadership was elected. Pine Ridge Estates eventually became exactly what it should have been from the beginning: a neighborhood instead of a power struggle. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. Luke graduated high school the following spring. We repaired fences that had nothing to do with lawsuits. We branded calves. We argued about football. We laughed again. Every evening I'd sit on the same front porch where my father once drank his coffee and watch the sun disappear behind the Wyoming hills. Sometimes I'd catch myself looking toward the spot where that auction sign once stood. not because I was afraid anymore, but because it reminded me how quickly ordinary people can lose something if they assume someone else will protect it for them. My grandfather used to tell me that land isn't really something you own. It's something you borrow from the people who came before you and hold onto for the people coming after. I understand what he meant now better than ever. This ranch was never just dirt, fences, or cattle. It was memory. It was family. It was every sacrifice that built a future one generation at a time. And maybe that's why I still think about one question. If I hadn't come home early, if Luke hadn't sent that text, if Henry hadn't made that phone call, would anyone have stopped them before it was too late? I'd really like to hear what you think. Was Vanessa simply blinded by power, or do you believe greed always finds a way to justify itself? Let me know down in the comments, and if this story made you think about how easily ordinary people can lose what matters most, share it with someone who needs the reminder. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do isn't fighting harder. It's refusing to step aside when we know we're standing on what's right.